Good evening. I'm John Abel, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this first lecture in our third Thursday lecture series for this 2024 season. I want to acknowledge the staff at the Historical Association and all the members of the History Committee who worked very hard to not only go out and find interesting speakers, but also to secure comfortable venues for us to hold these lectures in. And speaking of interesting speakers, tonight we have David Pierce, who is a journalist and comes here from the Midwest in 1969 as a teenager. Developed an appreciation for the natural beauty of the area, hiked the Appalachian Trail, and read and witnessed the Tocks Island dam situation unfold. That, he says, influenced his decision to become a journalist. Tocks Island is a significant factor in the history of the Poconos, and his book is a compelling narrative of that time in our history. So, please welcome David Pierce.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Monroe County Historical Association, and thank you all for coming. And I noticed there are a few repeat attenders. Thank you for coming back. Now, before I get started, I just want to explain a couple of these maps here. This map over here, it's about 8.5 feet long, I believe. It was one of 4 maps commissioned by the National Park Service in 1963. It was 65 when the Park Service won approval to put a national recreation area in here surrounding the dam and reservoir. But before that, they wanted to survey the land and see what they're dealing with, and they commissioned 4 different maps. And this one was produced by an old friend of mine, the late great Jim Francis, and it covered it shows the forest cover types in the park. And I remember him telling me once that when he was doing this survey in 1963, he had like surveying equipment, and he actually went in with a pack mule because he's going to some places that are pretty much off-road and difficult to get to, and that's how he did all that. And then back there in that bar area, a much smaller map shows, it's basically an Army Corps' acquisition map. And in August of 1972, it was a map showing what progress they made in acquiring property. And if you have a chance to look at it, the green area was going to be the National Recreation Area. The area in pink on that map, the pink areas were the reservoirs. They're actually talking about having a side reservoir on the Flatbrook in New Jersey, and they were going to divert up to 150 million gallons of water there for Newark and the urban areas of New Jersey, and then the rest on the main stem Delaware River. It was going to be a 37-mile long reservoir from Tocks Island northward, and that was expected to provide 500 million gallons of water a day. And anyway, that's on that map back there. And then there's another, just a geographic map to give you an idea of some of the area around here that was eyed by the federal government. And of course, we're here today to talk about Tocks Island and how the the reservoir and the recreation area were conceived, and how after being approved, after many years after being approved, how things changed to the point where the reservoir and recreation area was abandoned, and we have an expanded national recreation area today. Over here to the left was a little pamphlet that the Army Corps has put out, which I believe was distributed to people who were slated to lose their properties, and kind of go over to the process of what they planned. The reason why this is put on here is because it gives you a facsimile of what the dam may have looked like. Right there. And the dam would have been on the southern tip of Tocks Island, which is right here. There's the southern tip of Tocks Island, and they were talking about putting the dam there and then damming all the water northward. And they were running into a lot of glacial till underneath there, which meant that water could potentially seep under the dam and cause some problems. The critics charged that it would cause a dam burst, but the reason why the Army Corps wanted to put there at Tocks Island rather than upstream at Walpeck Bend, which is where the Army Corps' own study back in 1942 during the war, they were considering possibly building a dam back then, and the Army Corps' own study said there's too much glacial till. There wasn't enough bedrock because they needed to find solid bedrock to keep the water contained. Otherwise, it would seep under the dam and potentially cause a dam burst. But as time went on, the only reason that Pennsylvania and New Jersey did not build a smaller reservoir and dam up at Walpeck Bend, which is around the Bushkill area and Flatbrookville, the reason why Pennsylvania and New Jersey in 1955, they agreed to build their own dam there up at Walpeck Bend. But the reason why they didn't is because 2 months after the two states negotiated final approval, the Great Flood of 1955 happened. And then, of course, here in Monroe County, in the Broadhead, 75 people died in that flood. And a Senate and House committee, two committees, and President Eisenhower, they all said, wait a moment, we want the Army Corps to lead a multi-agency review of the entire Delaware River basin. The Delaware and then all the tributary streams that flow into the Delaware, and to reevaluate the whole thing. And Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they only picked the smaller reservoir because that's what the Park Service said originally. Plus, Pennsylvania and New Jersey wanted the feds to pay for the reservoir, so they said, okay, we'll wait for the Army Corps to do a reevaluation. And here's a little sketch of the Delaware River today. It's actually showing a few different reservoirs here that I believe the Susquehanna, the Hudson, the Connecticut river valleys, and the other river valleys, almost all of them across the country, have dams. And the Delaware River today is the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi. The Delaware is about 330 miles long, which as rivers go is not that long, but in terms of being undammed, it's the longest. And because it's undammed, there's a fish called shad. It's a herring, and it's an ocean-bearing fish. And just like you hear about salmon out in the Pacific and the West Coast, the shad would go upstream and lay their eggs in the rivers in fresh water, and then once the eggs were fertilized and they hatch, they look almost like minnows, the little fish. They come out and then they go downstream into the Atlantic, and they basically stay into the ocean until they're ready to go upstream and either lay or fertilize their eggs. And because the Delaware River is undammed, the shad runs still happen in great numbers in the Delaware, and in these other river streams, it's almost non-existent. And they've tried building fish ladders on the dams, but they don't seem to work very well at all. And most of the fish don't bother, but yet they come up the Delaware. But that's not to say that the Delaware is untouched by human hands, because New York City taps the upper reaches of the Delaware River. And I don't know if you can see it here in the map, but there's like a double pitchfork area here off the Delaware. Some of you can see that maybe. And those are the east and the west branches. And that's where the reservoirs are. And what New York State, New York City is doing is they're taking out 800 million gallons of water from the basin even before it has a chance to enter the stream. So they've lowered the stream level, but yet it continues to be free flowing. And as I just said, the city of New York, we're most interested in tapping the upper reaches of the Delaware Basin, the Delaware River Basin. And twice in the 1920s, they had delegations of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and they negotiated an agreement that would allow New York to go into the reservoirs and tap that water. And twice after they reached an agreement, the Pennsylvania and New Jersey legislatures refused to ratify them. They didn't want New York messing with the downstream stream flow here. And so New York State went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1931, and they got permission to build two reservoirs. And then in the 1950s, even before 20 years later, they still hadn't completed those two reservoirs, but they said, we think we're to meet our drinking water and industrial and residential use, that we're going to need a third reservoir. And so the states, again, they kind of reached an agreement that would have allowed New York to do that. And Governor Fine at the time of Pennsylvania said, we don't like this agreement because it looks like other states could veto our water projects. After New York gets its water, we're not going to get our water, perhaps. So we're going to, so he said, I'm going to appoint a committee to review this agreement. And then New York City and New York State said, well, if you're going to do that, we're going back to the Supreme Court. And while it was before the Supreme Court, New Jersey reached an agreement with New York City and New York State, and they said, New Jersey said to New York, okay, if you help us guarantee that we have enough water for our needs, we'll let you tap additional water for New York. And they called it the Montague formula because near Milford in Montague Township, New Jersey, just south of Port Jervis, is where they put in the stream gauge. And New York agreed to release water from their reservoirs every now and then when there's a drought. So it comes down here to us. And sometimes they argue over whether that's enough water or not. But generally, the states have worked fairly well together on that. as I said, once the flood of '55 hit, everything kind of went back to ground zero of reevaluating what's good for a dam and reservoir project. And the congressional committees went to work, and the Army Corps was asked to lead a multi-agency effort. That I mean, they had studies from some department, I don't know which department it was, but looking at how a reservoir would impact mosquitoes and flies, and they're looking at all sorts of different data. And meanwhile, the four governors of the four basin states, so you have New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and the state of Delaware, and the four governors and the mayors of Philadelphia and New York, they formed their own committee, and they supported the Army Corps study, but they're also pushing for a new multi-state basin agency that would stop them from fighting amongst themselves, and it would also make sure that the states got a lot of say about what projects are going to go. There wasn't going to be just the federal government dictating what goes on. And so the governors and the mayors, they created an agency that contracted with Syracuse University to do this study. And then meanwhile, there were people in the wake of the flood, but they were all pushing for dams. Everybody wanted a dam after the '55 flood for flood control. But this local attorney, Chud Benzinger, he was a Stroudsburg attorney, and he helped recruit people to form local, what they called flood control councils, just to advocate for that. And he was going all over, everywhere from Port Jervis down to Philadelphia, talking to local officials about doing that and supporting this new dam movement. And other members that belonged to that one of them was the former water commissioner of Philadelphia. And then this committee, the Syracuse group, came up with a committee, and they said, let's have a 5-member board, and the 4 governors will each appoint a member, and then the President of the United States will appoint a member, and those 5 people will decide what projects go on the basin and regulate what regulations are going to have for the waters. And by this time, when the final report came out, it was John Kennedy was president, and members of the Kennedy administration said, wait a moment, that could be unconstitutional, and you can't have states telling the federal government what to do. We're not going to go for that. And then the governors and the mayors and others, they lobbied for their group, and a lot of newspapers editorialized in favor of this agency. And finally, the federal government, through internal discussions and so forth, they said, well, there's no way that the states could approve something and expect the federal government to fund it unless the federal government approves. So they figured that was the proper safeguard right there, that the states would never agree to anything without a lot of federal funding, mostly federal funding, if not all of it. And therefore, they were willing to go along with the creation of what's now called the Delaware River Basin Commission. I guess a lot of people here probably know who this is, Nancy Shakaitis. And sure. Yeah, it's just fascinating what she did, where she came from, and with very little experience as a mass organizer, a public speaker, but yet she accomplished so much. And I do call her a one-woman dam opposition, But there were a few others who were there, a few people even before her. But one of the things that made her different from other dam opponents is that a lot of the meetings on what to do in the basin, they took place in Philadelphia or in Washington, D.C., the congressional hearings, and Nancy would go to these hearings and testify. And usually, almost always, she was the only person from this region, and certainly the only opponent, that said that, and she talked about the lack of bedrock and the glacial till and all those things, and saying that a dam was unsafe. But there were a few others. There's a group called the Anti-Dam Committee in Bushkill, and that was headed by summer resident Henry Schnitzer, who was a New Jersey industrialist who had a summer home in Bushkill. And then in Sandyston Township, New Jersey, which also was impacted by the dam and recreation area, there's a resident there named Charles Coons, a retired chemical engineer, and he kind of said, well, if they need water in the urban areas, maybe we have to put up with a reservoir, but we do not want a recreation area under any circumstances. And then also Charles Coons worked with the Sandyston Township Supervisors Board, and they were pushing to try to get the government to just move a lot of homes in the flood zone to higher ground, so that and help them rebuild so that they wouldn't lose their tax base as people were forced out of the reservoir area, that perhaps they wouldn't have to be forced out of the township altogether. And one of the first things Nancy did is that she heard Chud Bensinger, the guy I talked about before, that he was saying that the federal government, once they approve the reservoir and the recreation area, they need to quickly buy up these properties before inflation pushes the acquisition costs through the roof. And Nancy said, wait a moment, you're on the board of directors of this company that wants to build this this development at Hidden Lake. There's a new housing project there, and she said he was the speculator because these are going to be like lakefront homes, where the reservoir would be they'd be just above it. And Chud Bensinger said no, I'm just trying to help with the tax base, because if you build these luxury homes, that'll bring up the property values, and that'll make up for the lost property valuation when the federal government takes all this property and makes it tax exempt, that at least you would have this development to help make up for that loss. And then she went to her very first meeting was down in Philadelphia. Nancy went to a hearing by the new Delaware River Basin Commission to talk about what their reservoir priorities are going to be. And she was there with her notes. She wrote up a little 5-minute speech, and she was seated next to the mayor of Easton, Mayor Dr. George Smith. And Mayor Smith spoke first, and as he spoke, on a screen like this here, they flashed photos of all these dead people covered with white sheets, just laid out in a row. And Mayor Smith is saying, Easton exists. It was built in a floodplain. You can argue about that, but it's too late to do anything, except that we need the dam to make sure we don't have a situation where people are killed because of what happened in 1955. And Nancy's looking at these pictures, and she says, wait a moment, I know that place. That's Lanterman's Funeral Home in Eastburg. And those are people who died on the Broadhead, and no one actually died in the Delaware River. And of course, she came up and she had the presence of mind to say that and to call out the mayor on it before she read her prepared remarks. And when I was interviewing her about it, I said, well, after you sat down next to him, what did he say? And she said, well, I was afraid to sit down next to him, but when I did, you know, he said some public relations outfit must have got her to say that. And she said, now what public relations outfit would that be? You know, I went to all these hearings and invariably they'd ask, who do you represent? And I would say, I represent myself, I'm a homeowner. And that's all she had. So in 1962, the dam and the reservoir were approved, including the 37-mile reservoir. And finally, in 1965, they were having hearings on the recreation area that would go around there. It would have been about approximately 25,000 acres for the dam and reservoir, and 45,000 acres for the reservoir. And the reservoir would be like the donut hole, and around it would be the donut, would be the recreation area. And Nancy continued, even though the dam was already approved, and they'd say, it's too late to talk about the dam. It's been finalized, Congress has made its decision, but she would always bring up the safety issue and the lack of bedrock. And she was like jawing away with the subcommittee hearing chairman, a congressman from Alaska. And she said, the least you need to do is hold a hearing in this area. And they said, so we can't go to every nook and cranny around the country. We have votes on issues here in Washington. There's just no way that we can take time out to come up to the region. And the only thing I can tell you is you have 1 week if you want to send in written comments, and then the comment period's going to be closed and we're going to vote on it. And Nancy went home, and the next day she started circulating a petition to have a local hearing. And she left copies at post offices and stores. She left a copy at East Stroudsburg High School, East Stroudsburg South today, and the faculty and staff signed the petitions. And then she went up to Dingman's Ferry. She went all the way to Port Jervis and left the petitions there, and then she drove back and picked them all up. And within 4 days, she had 650 signatures, and she sent those in to the chairman of the committee, and then she collected more signatures and sent them, and they relented and held a hearing at East Stroudsburg High School. And about 500 people attended, and actually more people were in favor of the dam than were opposed to it in '65. And Congress went ahead and approved it, and things moved right along. I mentioned Bushkill, which is just north of here, and it's near Walpeck Bend. And Walpeck Bend is like the S-curve, or the Delaware River kind of goes like this. And people thought that would be a good place to put a dam and go northward from there originally. But just to show what these communities were possibly going out of existence, in Bushkill, they had a couple of churches, they had a bank, they had a small A&P supermarket, a couple of gas stations. I mean, it was a thriving little commercial center there, but yet it was susceptible to floods. And every time there's a flood, this wasn't the first time they heard about dams. After the 1889 flood, there was talk of building a dam there. Then in 1936, another flood, they talked about a dam. And then in 1955, they actually approved the dam there, and everybody there was getting ready to move out. And then the flood hit, and they had all this flood damage. And the problem it created for Bushkill residents is that those who had flood damage, they're saying, well, you're going to do the study that could take 3, 4, 5 years, and we have this flood damage. What are we supposed to do? Pay to fix up all our property damage, and then you're just going to buy us out for whatever you think the property's worth anyway? And that was the predicament that they found themselves in. And so the Bushkill, even though it was a thriving commercial center, it's not a local government. It's a hamlet, basically. Half of it's in Monroe County and half of it's in Pike County, and Pike County portion is Lehman Township. And the Lehman Township supervisors, they sent someone to Harrisburg to talk about how we need you to help buy out some residents now because of this issue about whether they should rebuild or not. And the Pennsylvania legislature actually approved $500,000 to buy out some property owners ahead of time. And then, so in 1959, they bought out 16 parcels. And some of them are boarding houses or to modest homes to a small motel, I believe, was in there. And they not only got money for their property damage, but a lot of them were allowed to rent from the state in the meantime until if and when there was a decision on whether to build a dam. But they only took care of 16 parcels, 16 sets of homeowners or property owners. And so they said, so the people who were left out, they were yelling and screaming to the state that you got to approve more money. And the Pennsylvania Secretary of Forests and Waters, a gentleman named Goddard, Mr. Goddard said, I'm sorry, but the legislature is not going to approve any more money. And some of them said, well, some of the people got bought out didn't have any flood damage. That's not fair. We have flood damage and we're still stuck here, but that's the way the situation played out. And then in the early 60s, in 1962, there was a proposal. The Lehman Township Planning Commission was looking for sites to move Bushkill to higher ground away from the reservoir and dam. And some people expressed interest in that idea initially, quite a few, but the money they got for their homes wouldn't have been enough really to rebuild there. And the federal government said, maybe we can give you some low interest mortgages with like 40-year repayment terms and some things like this. And then they found out it was even more complicated because first of all, Bushkill, because it's not a government incorporated community, they would have to become a borough government, and to do that, more than half the residents plus one, would have to sign a petition, send and give it to a local judge saying we want to incorporate it as a borough government. And then 2 years later they said, well, actually you need two of these because half the hamlets in Monroe County and half's in Pike County. So we need two of those, and each of those are going to have to be in agreement. And then people kind of soured on that, but the Lehman borough government, at first they said we have a location, but we're going to keep it secret because we don't want a developer to come in and raise the property values before we're ready. And then in '68, I think it is, they announced a location near the Bushkill Rod and Gun Club in the Pine Ridge development. But a resident took a poll of residents, and more than half of them said that basically we're ready just to move on and we don't want to commit ourselves to a new Bushkill. And so although the dam wasn't built, a lot of the property, most of it was bought up by the government and became part of the recreation area. I mentioned Nancy Shakaitis and her activism, and I mentioned Charles Coons of Sandyston Township, and some others. Nancy initially, she formed the Delaware Valley Conservation Association as an anti-dam group. It just started out with her recruiting 40 of her neighbors in Middle Smithfield Township. And she formed it basically in the days before that hearing that was held at East Stroudsburg High School. She got tired of hearing, who do you represent? She'd say herself. And now she could say, I'm with the Delaware Valley Conservation Association. And after the National Recreation Area was approved, within the following year, they went to New Jersey and the other places that are affected by the project and started recruiting affected homeowners into the DVCA. And their goal was to get 500 New Jersey members. And they reached that goal, and they had over 600 homeowner members who actually filed a lawsuit against the federal government saying that they're paying unfairly low prices, that people weren't getting the right value for what their property was worth, and some other issues that they brought up. But the judge, federal district judge, rejected their suit, saying that the Constitution gives the government the inherent power under eminent domain to take any property they want if it's going to serve a greater public good. And if they satisfy that, there's nothing people can do. And but other opponents did come on board during this era, and one of them has an interesting story. Her name is Joan Transu Matheson, and I mentioned Transu, her maiden name, because she originally lived here in Monroe County, but she married Colonel David Matheson, who was an Army colonel. Actually, he was an engineer, a West Point graduate engineer, World War II vet, and he was still with the Army Corps, and they bought property up in Dingman's Ferry in the flood zone in about 1960. And then in '62, David was reassigned to France to oversee the graveyard of American soldiers that were lost during the war. That he was assigned to oversee the care of graveyards there, and then he came back in 1966, and in 1967, Joan Matheson founded an anti-dam newspaper, because she felt the Pocono Record and other newspapers, the mass media, she felt that they weren't giving any ink to the anti-dam movement, and they weren't looking at some of the geological problems with the dam. And so she produced it in the cellar of her house, and she did her own artwork, like here. And her daughter helped her with some of the artwork, and she also started attending Army Corps and other dam group meetings and taking her notes and questioning officials just like any reporter would do, and writing up the stories herself in her own publication. And then she joined the Delaware Valley Conservation Association, and as she did that and got involved with the DVCA. It was good timing because Nancy kind of was taking a step back from the Delaware Valley Conservation Association she founded, because she decided to run for county commissioner. And against great odds, she won a seat on the Monroe County Commissioners. And the Pocono Record newspaper, after she was elected, said that she was believed to be, I don't know if this is fact, but she's believed to be the first woman ever elected a county commissioner in Pennsylvania. She was definitely the first woman, a female county commissioner here in Monroe. And then she was reelected 4 years later, and she became the first woman to be chairman of the county commissioners board on the 3-member board. And this is a very complicated story. And writing my book, I just hit myself in the head and saying, "There's yet another dam." I have to explain how this. But back in the 50s, when the Army Corps was doing its multi-agency study, the head of the Federal Power Administration, it would probably be the Energy Department today, but back then they called it the Power Commission, and they regulated a lot of public utilities. And the Power Commission representative looking at future uses for the Delaware River Basin, he contacted all the electric utilities within the Delaware River Basin, and the 3 utilities from New Jersey came up with this idea that we want to piggyback onto the Tocks Island Dam and create another dam for hydroelectric power. And they called it a pumped storage hydroelectricity. And the reason why they called it pumped storage is they were going to use, right here is Tocks Island, and and just south of Tocks Island, that's approximately where the reservoir would be. And pumped storage, you have to have a lower reservoir and an upper reservoir. And they said, we want to use Tocks Island reservoir itself as a lower reservoir, and then we want to pump that water up to the top of Kittatinny Range and over about 1,200 feet in all, like maybe 800 feet up and then 300 or 400 feet over, and use Sunfish Pond, which Sunfish was a glacial lake. I mean, there are a lot of man-made lakes around here, but this was actually created by the glacier, and it was a cold water fishery, one of the few cold water fisheries in the area. But they wanted to put a dike around it basically and increase the size. It's a 44-acre lake, and I think they wanted like 110 or 120 acres in all, and pump the water, say at 2 o'clock in the morning when there's low demand, that they would use electricity to pump all this water up and into that upper reservoir. And then the next day, when there's high electrical demand, they'd let the water back down again, and that would produce extra electricity. It actually would cost more energy than what they created, but because of the peak and off-peak hours situation, it was economical in that sense. And this gentleman named Glenn Fisher, he lived in East Stroudsburg, and he was a soil scientist for the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, and he used to hike the Appalachian Trail a lot over the New Jersey side as well as the Pennsylvania side, and he heard about this proposal and started rallying other hikers and saying, you got to stop the utilities from doing this. And as it turned out, the state, it was a Worthington State Forest, and the state of New Jersey bought about 6,000 acres here, basically this whole area here, the state of New Jersey bought in 1954 from Charles Worthington, who also owned this facility right here, Shawnee Inn and Golf Resort. He was the founder of this, and it was a hunting preserve for him over there across the river. And so after he died, the family sold the 6,200 acres to the state of New Jersey, and then in the early 60s, they sold the New Jersey governor sold 700 acres to the utilities for pump storage, but yet the locals didn't know about that until it was basically a done deal. And then, but once Glenn Fisher heard about it and started to publicize it, and one of the things Glenn would do is he liked to hike a lot, and so every year from then on for 4 or 5 years, he had an annual hike up the Appalachian Trail, or what became the McDade Trail, that hooked onto the Appalachian Trail. It would come up from Old Mine Road. This is Old Mine Road, and you come up this way and then connect to the Appalachian Trail and then go to Sunfish Pond. And so Glenn Fisher and others were trying to force the state of New Jersey to basically buy back the 700 acres from the utilities, to demand they just turn it over. And the utilities kept coming up with different proposals. One year they said, hey, we won't use Sunfish Pond anymore, but we want to build our reservoir right next to Sunfish Pond. And then Glenn Fisher said that won't work because that river water somehow from that reservoir will leak back in to Sunfish Pond anyway, and it will create algae, which will choke off the fish life there. And they tried different things, and then finally, the New Jersey utilities, which had already built a different pump storage project that was built on private property, not on any federal or state property at all. They had this little area pump storage unit that they wanted to make sure they protected that, and they basically gave back all except a little over 100 acres, I guess they kept, and the rest they did give back to New Jersey voluntarily. And I mentioned McDade Trail. One more thing I should say about this is that the McDade Trail is named after a sitting United States Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas. While he sat on the Supreme Court, he was pretty controversial in his day because he was a great advocate for Mother Nature. He wrote a lot about the Appalachian Trail, and he went to places to help protest projects that were going to interfere with the natural landscape. And Casey Kays, who started leading a letter writing campaign trying to get residents to write into their state legislators to force them to take back all this property. And he also wrote to Justice Douglas and said, will you come and help us? And Justice Douglas joined one of these annual pilgrimages, is what they call them. But these annual hikes was led by a Supreme Court justice here, and they named that trail the Douglas Trail after him a few years later. Moving right along, there are a lot of homes, particularly in the flood area, that it wasn't enough to buy up the properties. The Army Corps had to get rid of the houses that were on there. And for $100 or so, that they would give first dibs to the people who are losing their homes. But if not, they would say if someone wants to pay the price and is willing to physically move the home out of the flood zone, out of federal property, that we'll sell that. Maybe it'd be $100 for the house, but you might have to cut it up in 6, 7, 8 pieces and move each piece up, literally piecemeal. And who knows how many thousands that would cost just to transport it. And then you'd have to buy a piece of land, and then you'd have to hook utilities up to it. And it was pretty involved, but there are a lot of houses that were moved to other developments in and around the area today. And another thing that was going on during the early days of property acquisition, that the land speculation and inflation in general is just driving, those of you, probably aren't too many of you who are as old as I am, but if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you know, inflation, even compared to today, was massively out of control. And between that and the costly Vietnam War, the Army Corps wasn't getting enough appropriations to buy up very much property every year. And so 5 years in to the recreation area and 8 years in on the reservoir, they had bought less than 20% of the property that was needed, and also because of that, people felt the Army Corps was lowballing residents and not giving them what their money's worth is, especially when you're talking about riverfront property. You know, if you're going to move somewhere on the Broadhead Creek or McMichaels or anywhere, it would be hard with the money they got as compensation to replace what they lost with the view and the surroundings. And all that fed more opposition. And then, of course, the environmental issues also became more in vogue. This is in Walpack, New Jersey. That one thing I wanted to mention about this map, and this is the map I was talking about that's back there by the bar area. And there are actually 2 reservoirs here. Right there to the south, or actually be to the east, was the Flatbrookville Reservoir, the smaller reservoir for New Jersey, and then the larger reservoir right on the Delaware River, which would be Philadelphia and downstream suburbs, including New Jersey, and as well as Pennsylvania. But the one reservoir would store up to 150 million gallons a day, and then the main reservoir would be 500 million gallons a day. And the green areas down here were 2 New Jersey developments, Blue Mountain Lakes and Skyline Acres. And there were, and then Hidden Lake up on the Pennsylvania side, which I don't think it would be hard to find, for me to find it offhand on this map, but it was basically near Nancy Shakaitis' house on Mosher's Knob, off of Mosher's Knob, that there's a company that I mentioned earlier, Chud Benzinger, who served on the board of directors, and they wanted to create a new development there at Hidden Lake. And all those, and the head of the Interior Department, which oversees the National Park Service, he actually cited this, what was going on here in this region, and said, you got to help me get more money so I can buy up these properties before they get even more expensive. And one of these developments, Skyline Acres, was in a battle with Walpeck Township even before federal officials approved the recreation area. And part of the problem is that back in the 20s, there was a development there, and there were a couple of houses built, but there were a lot of lots that were sold and never developed. And then the Great Depression came in the 30s, and in the 50s, Skyline Acres was born, and Skyline Acres started selling lots and having homes built on this land without extinguishing the original covenants of the old development. And so basically what happened is you had some properties that were being double sold. And Walpeck Township, as it turned out, in some cases, was double taxing the same piece of land because they didn't know what was where. And Walpeck was trying to clean up this mess. And they were, and a lot of properties, people just abandoned them from the first developer, and then some were not sold yet, but they basically gave up on the properties, and the township was trying to clean up the mess, and they were trying to get back taxes from these people, the original owners, and trying to figure this all out. And one of the things that a judge agreed that the new developer had to do was put markers up. And so that's one of the markers. And I hiked there just to get the lay of the land when I took a picture, and there are all these around one of the lakes there they were using for the development. Boom. And the reason why I say boom is that way over to the right, there's the river, and it's just out of view, but Tocks Island is there on the river. And then on the other side, in New Jersey, there was a horizontal test tunnel being blasted through the Kittatinny Range. And basically, it was going to be 5 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and 700 feet long, horizontally through the ridge. And once it was completed, it would allow geologists and all the Army Corps specialists to go in there and do their testing to see how this area would react to holding dam water back. And so they're doing this blasting. It started in the summer of 60. I think it was the summer of 68 into the winter of 69. And every time they blasted over there in New Jersey, over there to the right here, this is River Road. Here off of Rivers Road was Mary Edna and Sal Papalardo's property. And their house shook every time there's an explosion. And they're finding cracks in their walls, their ceilings, their tile. I mean, Mr. Papalardo actually laid tile for a living, and then he had to put up with all this damage. And then in the midst of all this, he's trying to contact the Army Corps officials. He's contacting their local land office, which was over in East Stroudsburg, where the National Guard Armory was for several years, kind of across from Walmart. That's where the Army Corps had his local land office, and he kept trying to contact them and get some information to get them to stop the blasting or to do something about it. And then he's also contacting his congressman. And a few months later, in the midst of all this, after not getting an answer, the Army Corps sends him notification saying that that we appraised your house so long ago that we want to do an updated appraisal before we move on with buying up your home. So in other words, that damage would be baked in, and they would get less for their property. And finally, around February of '69, the Army Corps did contact them and said we're done with all the blasting. The test tunnel is done, and if you want to get compensation, here's the name of our contractor, and you can contact the contractor and their insurance company, and they'll compensate you. And so the contractor sent over a couple of workers, and they looked at it, and according to Mary Edna Papalardo, she lived to be 102, just died in 2021. But anyway, I never met her, but she wrote a family memoir, and she said when these two people came over that they were generally shocked to see all the damage, but they didn't admit to anything, and they said, we'll get back to you. And they didn't hear from them, so the Papalardos, they said, we better hire an attorney. And the attorney went to Monroe County Court, and they got a judgment for something like $14,000 of damage, and the judgment was not challenged by the contractor at all. The contractor just ignored the hearing, and the order was, the court ordered the payment to be made, and then a week to 10 days later, the attorney calls the Papalardos and said, so I'm sorry to tell you this, but the company has filed for federal bankruptcy protection, and we're not going to see a penny out of them. And so they moved out in '71. They moved to that mobile home court off of 447. Some of you may know that. And in '71, and then finally in '74, the attorney kept pestering the Army Corps, and they got $8,000 in additional compensation. And Mr. Papalardo died a few months later, and then his wife lived for another, 45, 50 years. And then the other thing that makes this significant is that I'm sure many of you know about the squatters and that situation, that people sold their homes, that were forced to sell their homes, and then the Army Corps, because of the slow process that I mentioned before, and acquiring all the properties they needed, the Army Corps said, well, we should do something to limit vandalism and to maybe at least if someone's occupying these homes for the short term, that would help us out. So the Army Corps started a rental program, and a lot of residents were upset about that. And especially some people who lost their homes are saying, what is this? You kicked us out of our homes, and yet you're just letting other people move in. And to be fair, people did have an option of living 1 year for free after a sale of a house. And if they wanted to pay rent, depending on what the Army Corps is willing to charge them, they could have stayed for a while longer until they're ready to use that property for the federal purposes. But in any case, this went on, and after a year, the Army Corps said, "You're okay. We hear you, and we're not renewing any of the leases." But people refused to move out when their leases expired, and then other people moved in, and they all happened to be young, probably hippies, is what they called them in our day back then, and the Army Corps initially called them squatters, and the squatters themselves accepted that as their name to go by. And they formed a squatter parents committee because some of them had small children, toddlers, or people who went to elementary school. And it took 2 federal raids and a 40-month occupation before they finally got the last of the squatters out on February 28th, 1974. And this is kind of a catch-all of what killed the dam. A lot of things killed the dam. And one of them was the occupation. A lot of people were mad at the squatters, but by and large, a lot of local people were more mad at the Army Corps because they're the ones who created this rental program to begin with. And so that was one issue. And in 1972, Monroe County and Warren County both had non-binding voter referendums on whether or not to build a reservoir, and both counties by large margins voted no. So we don't even want it anymore. And then by smaller margins, they said that we would go along with making everything a recreation area. And then there was the National Environmental Policy Act was passed by Congress, which required going forward that any project with an environmental impact that was using federal funds would mean that group would have to hold public hearings and file an environmental impact statement. And that law's on the books to this day, that they have to do that. And then other environmental issues came up, not just the loose glacial till and the safety of the dam, but at first they're saying, well, if you're going to be sending water to New York and to Philadelphia every few days, or when you keep raising and lowering the water level, you're going to have these massive mud flats, and it's going to create mosquitoes and all these different issues and other environmental problems. And then some of the oversight agencies said, well, we think the Army Corps, after a while they said, we think they have a plan to address that. But the other issue that came up after that was basically you're taking a free-flowing river and you're turning it into a still lake, and that means algae is going to grow all over the place, and the algae is going to be fed by human waste and by cow and chicken manure from upstream. It's just going to come into this, and it's going to kill off all the wildlife. And basically, there was no answer for it. And then the Delaware River Basin Commission, and the group of the 4 governors, they approved a plan, a $362 million plan. This is back in the early 70s, to build a massive sewage system that would go completely around the reservoir, like all the way up to Milford, basically, and all the way down here to East Stroudsburg. And they'd start out with a massive central treatment plant, and then have smaller plants all along there. But it was really expensive, and that $362 million didn't include the cost for residents and businesses to hook into the system. And so it was really expensive. And Joan Matheson, who did that underground Tocks Island newspaper, she called the project Frankenstein's John. And that just fed more local opposition. And I contend that it was local opposition more than anything else that killed the dam. Because I think if there is local support, even with the requirement to file environmental impact statement and do all this stuff, if the public favored it, they would have found a way to get it done. But the public didn't. They were very much against it. And in July of 1975, the governors voted 3-1 not to build it. And Basically, that was the end of it, although it was really 1992 before its deauthorization became final. Okay, well, thank you very much. And if you haven't already and are interested, please consider buying the book. Thank you.